Hello, everybody. We'll get going in a second. Just give a chance for people to come in. We've got another sort of highly signed up to webinar today, so I'm sure people will be coming in as we go. Well, look, I will kick off. Just because it's such a big topic, lots to hear about today from our marvelous speakers, and yeah, I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion among everybody at the end. So let me, of course, start by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on whose various lands that we're meeting today across the country. I'm here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands and in Canberra, and want to pay respects to elders past and present. So I'm Sharon Friel. I'm director of the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse, which is the host for these Saving the World webinars. And as many of you will know, one of the big things that we're concerned about in the hothouse is this question of transforming the global consumptogenic system, this system of policies, of institutions, of commercial activities, and of norms that absolutely bake in the extraction, production, consumption of fossil fuel goods and based goods and services, which of course are terrible for the environment, but they're also really bad for human health and well-being, and they're very unequally distributed and valued. And so these big questions of how do we transform such a system? What does that system look like in different parts of the world, and how to change that? So that's what many of our discussions are about on the Saving the World webinars. And I'm so pleased to be joined today by colleagues who are really thinking about this intersection with climate change, environmental issues, questions of global equity, and then, as you'll hear, in immediate and indirect implications for people's health and well-being. So, as always, I'm joined by one of the laureate, the Hothouse Research Fellows, Dr. Desh Gadgeril. Desh, as many of you know, is a political scientist and is going to sort of take questions or sort of start the conversation with our two speakers. And our two speakers have led this really, really interesting piece of work that you're going to hear about now. So our very own from the School of Regulation and Global Governance, Associate Professor Nick Bainton. Nick's an anthropologist and has been doing beautiful work for years across the region, and well, particularly across the Pacific Islands region, asking these sort of questions of the social, the political impacts of resource extraction in that part of the world, and really seeing through those eyes of an anthropologist just what this means on the ground for people's everyday lives. He could tell many, many stories that would curl your toes about these sorts of issues. And then really delighted to meet a new colleague, Dr. Eleanor Lebreth from the University of Queensland. Eleanor is a senior research fellow at the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining way up there in Queensland, the Sustainable Minerals Institute at UQ, and has really been leading some of this fascinating work, and particularly looking at this spatial dimensions of the environmental, social, and governance questions around the mining sector. So two incredible colleagues doing fantastic work that is so relevant for planetary health equity. You may not call it that, but it doesn't matter. It's so relevant for these, these big challenging issues. So, Nick, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Sharon. Bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, how's that? All good? Okay, all right, thank you. So I'll also like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I want to acknowledge First Nations peoples wherever people are situated today, because whenever I'm talking about these topics to do with extraction, climate change, and the energy transition, it's First Nations people that are quite often disproportionately affected by these larger global processes. So I think that's an important place for us to begin with this talk. So as Sharon mentioned, we've been working on these questions for a while around the intersection of these global processes. And what I'm going to do today is talk you through a recent paper of ours that it examines a particularly wicked problem. And this is when a complex issue actually serves to amplify exposure to the same underlying issues. And we've called this phenomenon compound exposure. So what I'll try and do today is really give you a kind of a narrative version of this problem and then how we've tackled it in the paper to set us up for a conversation afterwards. All right. So look, by now, we're all fairly well versed in the primary solution to climate change, which is a rapid energy transition to renewable energy. So notwithstanding global commitment to fossil-fueled capitalism, pressure is mounting to enact this transition as soon as possible. In many respects, this solution is conceived in quite unproblematic terms, a kind of simple swapping out of one source of energy for another, allowing most other parts of our lives to remain unchanged. And I'll return to this problematic point later on. It's not my intention here today to dwell on the different types of renewable technologies or the technical, political, and economic challenges of enacting the transition. For now, the main point I want to land is that the idea of an energy transition has really become the dominant solution to our shared climate crisis. So it's also commonly understood that building all this new energy infrastructure is going to require a lot of raw materials. And the mining industry's been very quick to seize on this point, promoting itself as essential to the climate solution. In other words, the energy transition is generating enormous demand for certain commodities, which in turn is generating enormous pressure to open new mines or expand and extend existing ones. In its current form, the energy transition will be built off the back of the mining industry. So somehow we're going to mine our way to planetary survival. We often hear a lot of talk about the demand for critical minerals. And so for those of you who are less familiar with the term, critical minerals are those minerals that are defined by nations as being critical to their needs. So it's quite broad. The term originally arose during the First World War, evolving from a focus on war minerals to a broader understanding of materials essential or critical for national defence and economic stability. So what this means is there's no universal list of critical minerals. Individual countries usually define the list a little bit differently. So it's partly for this reason that my colleagues at University of Queensland coined a more encompassing term, energy transition minerals, or ETMs for short. And this really refers to that full suite of minerals and metals that are needed for energy infrastructure. You'll see from the table here, it includes things that we'd expect, like rare earths and copper, but also bulk commodities like iron ore, which are less commonly talked about in relation to the energy transition. So how much are we talking about? What are these sorts of future mineral projections? The figures I've got here, they're taken from the International Energy Agency's latest outlook, so for 2024. And it shows the increasing amounts of materials and minerals that are going to be needed between now and 2040 to meet net zero energy targets. The light blue shows the amount that's needed for clean energy projects. But here's the thing, the dark blue shows how much is needed for other uses that have nothing to do or very little to do with clean energy. The dark blue shows the increasing level of extraction or the increasing level of supply that's going to be needed for technology and infrastructure underpinning our modern existence. And it also includes things like defense systems. So these images, they tell many stories, but one thing in particular jumps out. As much as the energy transition is needed and will require a good deal of raw materials, this solution is largely premised on maintaining the status quo in our consumptogenic lives. It also helps to highlight how the energy transition has given the extractive industries, or the mining industry in particular, something of a free pass. So more mining is justified in the name of the energy transition, even though a good deal of this mining is for things unrelated to the energy transition. So more mining will generate more risks for society and environments. And in a nutshell, I think that's the basic contradiction of our times. So this was essentially one of the starting points that Eleanor and my other colleagues at UQ began with when they then went about building a data set to try and look at this problem on a much more global scale. So Eleanor, I'll hand to you to speak to that briefly.
Thanks, Nick. Do you want to move to the next slide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go.
So this is, I guess, a summary of the methodology that we have adopted for this paper and for other papers. So basically, the concept was to overlay mining project locations with a set of other data sets that were relevant to mining and said something about the environmental, social, and governance context in which mining was taking place. So we have this global database of mining project locations, which tell us which commodities are being targeted and also their size, resource and reserves, tonnage, and all sorts of information. And that spatial overlay, we've used a set of different data sets to test these locations. So I'll quickly go through those 7 dimensions that we use for this paper, so you understand a little bit more how they apply to mining. So first of all, we have nature conservation. So we know that mining is a disruptive activity. It takes a lot of material out of the ground, and it will almost inevitably have a negative effect on biodiversity and also very often causing deforestation. So for that, we have data sets like key biodiversity areas. So we look at whether mining projects are located in areas that are key for biodiversity conservation. We also have the data set of protected areas. Does mining fall into these protected areas or nearby? Then we have water. So water is also a very important dimension in mining because mining requires a lot of water for mineral extraction. So we are interested in looking at where mining intersects with areas that are water scarce. And so there may be competition with other water users because of limited resources. Then another dimension is extreme events. And we're thinking about climate related events such as cyclones, but also earthquakes. And these events, they often cause disruptions to mining, but those disruptions can cause environmental issues, and quite often that's seen in the failures of the containment of waste at mine sites. We have examples of tailings dam failures, for example, that were caused by an earthquake or caused by a massive amount of rain overflowing. So those weather events or earthquakes have also caused environmental pollution, I guess, as they interact with mining activities. So that's the environmental dimensions that we look at that can be understood from a spatial perspective. And then we have social dimensions. And for that, we have also a set of spatial data sets that are related to this dimension. So for communities, we look at essentially population density. So are there people living really nearby the mine? And what's also the demographic arrangement in different, I guess, 100 kilometers away from the mine? What's the average population density around, to understand how remote the site is and whether there are actually people who might have to be relocated because of the mining operation. We look also at social vulnerability. So for that, we look at indexes like the Human Development Index or the Gini coefficient to look at inequalities, to understand the income, education, and health profile of the communities around the mine. And land uses is a third very important dimension, because mining requires land and it depends on land acquisition. And if that land has been used for something else, if it's for agriculture, for example, that may challenge existing livelihoods in those locations. Finally, we have governance, and governance particularly looking at the corruption of the jurisdictions in which these projects are located, and regulatory quality that tells us about existing safeguards against negative impacts of mining, and tells us about also the redistribution of benefits that's possible from mining. So just to finish this, so what we did for this paper is we had this framework that is a global framework. So we have data for more than 5,000 ETM mining projects around the world. But what we did is we extracted particularly the projects located in the Pacific Islands. So we had 163 projects, and we compared it with the rest of the world. Basically, that was what's happening against those ESG criteria. Next slide, Nick. Thank you. And yes, just to say that this is a methodology that we have applied across several publications. You're most welcome to have a look. But this is the only paper where we really selected one geographic region to compare against the rest of the world. So this is the particularity of this paper. I'll hand back to you, Nick.
Super, thanks for that. Okay, so that gives you a sense of what the work that's been sitting behind this. And look, as Sharon said, I've been thinking about these things. It's really for the last 25 years, but very much at the ground level. And seeing how these impacts play out. So it was the work of Eleanor and my other colleagues as they were looking at this at the global scale. Then I started thinking, well, what happens if we take this sort of grounded knowledge and then we try and see, well, how does that play out at scale? And what does that tell us about the region and the sorts of risks that it might be confronting? So then, with some funding then from the British Academy, we were able to team up on this and begin to do some really interesting work directed just at the Pacific. So as a starting point then, we know that the Pacific is already acutely exposed to the effects of climate change. This is not an abstract menace somewhere far away, somewhere in the future. Here, climate change is an immediate existential threat to Pacific lives and sovereignty. We also know that the Pacific region has a devastating legacy of extractive activities, and this is most exemplified by the Panguna copper mine that was developed in the late colonial period in the island of Bougainville off of Papua New Guinea. This same mine also generated massive environmental impacts, which amongst other factors sparked a horrific 10-year civil war. So while this is an extreme example, similar processes and conflicts have played out at just about every mining project across the region. And so it's that sort of background that we're holding in mind as we're looking to the future. So to take another example then, the devastating colonial legacy of phosphate mining on Nauru. This left the island looking like a decimated moonscape. So with no alternative economic options, Nauru has been forced to host Australia's offshore detention centre in what amounts to a form of human extractivism. In this case, we see how the future of some Pacific nations is over-determined by the logics of extractive capitalism. Against this longer historical backdrop, we also know that the Pacific it's a rich repository of the minerals and metals that are needed for the energy transition. Some of these are found in terrestrial landscapes, and then others are found on the deep seabed of the Pacific Ocean. Many Pacific nations are already heavily dependent on the extractive industries, or they're turning to the possibility of seabed mining as a way of generating income to achieve their development goals, and more importantly and problematically, to fund activities to deal with the threats and disasters of climate change that are coming their way. So it was working from that global data set that, as Eleanor said, we then identified a subset of about 165 projects in the Pacific that are at various stages of development. So both greenfields and brownfields projects, those that are proposed and those that are already operating. What we're anticipating is that there's going to be increased pressure to access those resources, and a lot of that pressure is going to be applied in the name of the energy transition. That's going to be a leverage point for justifying further extraction. So we wanted to know, what are the risks when these extractive pressures and these climate pressures then begin to converge, and to begin to look at those together. And this is something that hasn't really been considered in a lot of the literature, because they tend to remain as fairly distinct bodies of scholarship, and we wanted to start to bring them together more substantively. So as Eleanor said, we mapped these pre-existing vulnerabilities across a series of different indicators, social, environmental, and governance, and compared that with global results. The main finding, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that vulnerability indicators for the Pacific are generally higher than compared to the global results. So this was one of the things that really got our interest. Well, how at risk is this region? So to take just one set of indicators as an example, so we can see here that some 87% of these ETM projects in the Pacific are in jurisdictions with very high income inequalities, compared to only about 59% globally. These measures signal poverty, insecurity, demographic pressures, low levels of education and health. These low-level baseline conditions mean that populations are very ill prepared to deal with the impacts of extraction or climate change, or when they converge together. So essentially, this data set that we've built helps to demonstrate that if there's a scramble for resources in the Pacific, this is going to create new perverse patterns of harm in places that are already exposed to multiple intersecting stresses and vulnerabilities. So as we looked at this data, and we've reflected on the contradictory processes that are playing out in places like the Pacific and other parts of the world, we started to see a broader pattern, and this is what we came to call compound exposure. So the figure here really is just a basic schematic of that concept. If we work from left to right on this, we can see a feedback loop between extraction and climate change that's reinforced by the need to access materials in the name of the energy transition. And as these extractive activities are then conducted under changing environmental conditions, these extractive contexts become more volatile, enlarging localized exposure to harm. The arrow travels in both ways, because some Pacific leaders prioritize extractive-led development, and these decisions also help to reproduce the global extractive industries. Extractive impacts are going to become increasingly amplified by the effects of climate change, and these, as I've said, are disproportionately experienced throughout the region. Finally, these situations, they're not static. New forms of vulnerability are likely to aggravate each other because they'll overlap or interact across space and time. So we need to consider how vulnerability might accumulate or recede in different places and different times, and across the mine life cycle, for example. And then we want to be able to see that how these changes play out, and the sorts of feedback loops that we get between problems and proposed solutions. So finally, all of this brings us to the question of governing increasing levels of complexity. Pacific leaders are grappling with multiple intersecting interests, needs, and threats. The 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent is just one example where they're attempting to chart a way through this sort of complexity. At the core of it all, Pacific leaders are trying to find ways to assert their sovereign rights and to use and develop their natural and human resources for the benefit of their people. But the patterns that we've identified in our research, they point to the possibility that the Pacific could become a poorly regulated quarry for the rest of the world. So as extractive companies court Pacific leaders and try and seek access to their resources in the name of a global climate change solution, we need to ask, well, who stands to gain the most from these arrangements and who has the most to lose? Now, there are a lot of questions for policymakers and regulators to consider here, but I'll leave you with just one particularly vexing question we think is often overlooked. This current situation really highlights the need for careful policy positions that consider how extractive activities simultaneously support and undermine sustainable development goals and the capacity and capability to manage and adapt to climate change. So I'll leave it there for the moment. We can jump into some questions.
Brilliant, Nick. That was fantastic. Slightly terrifying, but fantastic. So now I'm going to hand over to you, Desh. You've got some questions to get us going, picking up on various aspects of what Nick and Eleanor have just spoken about. So yeah, huge thanks to both of you, and over to you, Nick. Desh.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick and Eleanor. That was a very fascinating presentation, although scary, like Sharon said. So I do have a couple of questions related to the presentation in your paper. And if we could just start those off, and then we'll later go on to the audience questions as well through the chat. So my first question, Nick and Eleanor, relates to the extractive industries themselves. So as you pointed out, this global transition to renewable energy looks like it's going to increase our dependence, at least on some of the extractive industries. So what do you think this means for the future, both for Pacific Islands and maybe for the world more generally as well?
Thanks. I think I'll jump in with a quick answer, and then I'll throw to Eleanor for this one. Probably a good place to start is just to define, what do we mean by extractive industries? So it's not just mining. And when we talk about mining, there are multiple mining sectors as well, but it's oil and gas. And then we've got, hard rock mining, and then potentially seabed mining on the horizon as well. And within the mining sector, then we've got different commodities like coal that we're trying to phase out of. And then we've got commodities like gold, which is just going through the roof at the moment with all-time highs, like over 2,000 an ounce at the moment, which is just unbelievable. So, and that's showing no signs of ever being a commodity that we're going to phase out of. So I think it's important to sort of differentiate at that level a bit. And then my general point I'd make is that whilst we're clearly trying to transition out of some reliance on some sectors of the extractive industries, I think as the sort of larger point that we make in the paper is that it's all these other aspects of our consumptogenic lives that really remain untouched, and continue to be heavily dependent on extraction and use of a whole range of different natural resources. So I think the energy transition itself doesn't necessarily move us away from reliance on extraction per se. Eleanor.
Thanks, Nick. I'll just add a little bit of just a nuance to say that. So I guess if we are looking at a shift from fossil fuels to metals, I guess, which is the case if we are moving from fossil fuel-based energy system to a renewable-based. The little bit of a difference here is that you have lithium, for example, in a battery. That lithium is going to stay in that battery and function that battery for 15 years, right? Whereas at the moment, to operate a regular car, we need to feed constantly fossil fuels into our system. So there's a slight difference there, where I guess that there is an in-use stock of metals that will not have to be replaced as frequently as what we do now. So it's just a little bit of nuance there. That being said, as I completely agree with what Nick was saying, that this shift is also, this shift is also going to be seen in terms of changing locations of mining. So I guess coal regions that are primarily having a lot of jobs associated to coal mining, some of these regions are they don't have energy transition minerals. So you cannot just switch jobs to new mines that would extract these minerals. Whereas you'll have other regions that are very rich in energy transition minerals and haven't had any mining before. So there is this shift in location as well as we shift to other resources.
That's actually a great segue to another question that I had as well, which is, so as you say, a lot of these metal and mineral extraction activities that are happening in the Pacific Islands, while they are posing problems, they're also presenting a lot of economic opportunities potentially to people in those relatively poorer places as well. And that might then provide one of the ways for these nations to meet the climate crisis with a bit more resources as well, right? And so in that sense, and this is what you touched on, Nick, with the question that you had at the end of the presentation as well. But so what does this kind of tension between harm and opportunity mean for the Pacific Islands? So how do governments tackle this tension, do you think?
Yeah, that's the vexing question that plays out in debates across the region and then in other parts of the world as well. It's, in a kind of simple sense of trade-offs and opportunities. And I've sat in a lot of meetings and sort of roundtable events, particularly with seabed mining. This is where it comes up a lot. This is the opportunity, and for some of the very small Pacific Island nations, this presents itself as really an economic lifeline, and they see this as an opportunity to secure their economic future, but also to be able to provide an economic base to ensure their political sovereignty, and as they face very real threats to that future. I think where this becomes problematic is then when we look at the history of the way in which resource wealth has been generated and then used, and who benefits, particularly across this region. We've had various resource booms. We looked at Papua New Guinea, for example, where it's made some people extremely well off and lifted some people out of poverty, but for many others, it's entrenched that poverty. It's left them dispossessed of land and left them in a far worse situation than they were before. And then at a national level, you ask the questions: well, where has that wealth been gone? Where has it been used? Who are those ultimate beneficiaries? I mean, even in Australia, as a supposedly more developed and mature regulated nation, I mean, we've in some ways failed to capitalize on our own resource booms. So I think this is a question that's confronting each nation that's dealing with these possible options, and how they would then secure that wealth and be able to ensure that it does genuinely benefit the populations into the future. But unfortunately, the track record has been quite dismal.
So, given the situation on the ground, well, Nick, as an anthropologist who has worked extensively in the Pacific Islands, so you have seen how the impacts of climate change and inequality are compounded by the activities of mining companies on the ground. So would you maybe be able to give us a sense of what it is like for people in these islands who have been impacted by the activities of the extractive industry, so in this era of global warming specifically?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because the paper we've got here is kind of really dealing with a much more bird's eye view, and trying to look at things from that elevated perspective. And in some ways, the paper's a bit of a teaser for the book that we've got coming out, that then attempts to look at this, come back down to the ground level and build out a series of cases, ethnographic cases, of what that lived reality of compound exposure really looks like. And so a couple of examples that I've got here that are sort of top of mind, that we've been building into that book. So at one of the mines in Papua New Guinea, for example, the Hidden Valley mine, this plays out as a kind of, for people on the ground, it's like an embodied material transformation for them. That's how they're experiencing both climate change and resource extraction. And they live on a land that they both care for and then rely upon for their own subsistence. And the men in that community, they have a role as subsistence farmers and as landowners, but then many of them also go and labour in the mines, and they rely upon the mine for an income. It's really the sole source of economic development in that region. And where we've seen over the last decade where there's been drought events, it's impacted mine productivity. And then there's been periods where the mine has then had to pause operations, and it sends all the workforce home for an indefinite period of time. So then that means that those workers, they then don't have an income to support their family. But there's sort of a double level of precarity there, because they also find that their subsistence farms or their gardens are also impacted by that same drought event. So whereas the expatriate mine managers and the people who typically are in the more senior roles, they can fly back to their home countries, they've still got an income, they're not as impacted at that level by the drought event. But then at the local level, will people then experience that precarity in that double sense, and it's much more compounding for them, if you like. And then another example I've got is where people's again, their livelihood practices have been impacted because of frost events, and so where they would normally deal with that in the past by just simply moving to lower altitudes, they find that because of the high levels of conflict, and this is around the Porgera gold mine, very high levels of conflict and in-migration and settlement in the lower parts of the valley means that people can no longer use that strategy to move down to lower altitudes. And likewise, the people who are experiencing high levels of conflict as a result of all the effects of the mining operation, they can't exercise their traditional strategies for sort of moving upwards or moving elsewhere. So these are the sorts of daily complications that people then encounter when these pressures start to converge. And I think this is something we need to understand much more and be able to build into policy responses, into our forms of regulation of the extractive industries. But also, I think it's very much a blind spot in our thinking around future climate impacts as well.
So, moving towards potential solutions, let's say, right? So you mentioned in the paper that one way to avoid or at least reduce compound exposure for vulnerable populations might be to explore alternative ways of fighting climate change, besides this global transition to renewable energy that relies on metals and minerals, especially the types that are mined in the Pacific. Now, so what might some of these potential alternative solutions be, which might be less damaging for the people in the Pacific?
Yeah. Look, I think keeping this at a sort of fairly broad general level, my sense is that in the absence of any real engagement with ideas around degrowth or post-growth or fundamentally changing the relationship between society and the environment, it's going to be really difficult to move things in a positive way. And we're going to continue to see these forms of compound exposure play out. But the thing that we've really come to see, particularly through the research that we've been doing and then the role that the extractive industries plays in this solution, is that it's hegemonic. And that means that it crowds out or suppresses the possibility for having those other conversations. So we find that we're then locked into this kind of extractivist logic. And I think that's what we find most problematic in this. And then what we see play out within the industry is this hegemony means that it kind of locks us into knowing a lot less around these sorts of complexities, for example, that we've just spoken to, at a time when we really need to know a lot more. And so that's where we find this particularly problematic.
Yeah, those are some excellent answers to those questions. Thank you very much.